Welcome everyone, I'm Major Chris Kripchak and I'll be your host for this discussion with the eSchool Graduate PME's resident national security expert, Dr. Karen Guttieri. But before I turn the webinar over to Dr. Guttieri, a few admin notes. This webinar will last approximately an hour and will be recorded and posted on program homepages. The webinar format is both a presentation and discussion. While presenting, Dr. Guttieri will pause her webcam and then resume it for discussion. Use the chat feature to discuss, answer, and ask questions, the latter of which I will help bring to Dr. Guttieri's attention during the discussion periods. Of course, please feel free to post your questions at any time. Now, should our internet connection drop us on our end, the webinar will remain open. So please stay logged in while we log back in. Finally, at the end of this session, I'll ask you to provide feedback on this webinar experience, which will help us shape future engagement events. And with that, let's begin. Dr. Guttieri.
Hi, can I see a sign? Can you hear me all right? Excellent, excellent. All right, so let's talk about the United States National Security Strategy. What words come to your mind when you think about United States national security? What words come to your mind when you think about strategy? Now you can see me. All right. So what words come to your mind? You might want to even write those words down. Keep them in mind. You know, keywords are a term we use to describe words that have a special significance, right? And they are words that are going to help us to unlock a code. And so my goal today is to help to decipher a little bit for you. Excellent, I see you writing things down. Decipher a little bit for you the new 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States of America, released by Donald J. Trump's administration in December of 2017. Now, this is an academic conversation. I hope we all appreciate that. So I'm going to give a little disclaimer here. But I want to take this opportunity to talk about how we're going to be drawing upon our worldviews, just like every president who comes into office is bringing a particular worldview. And so we have a little poll for you that we'd like to ask you to take a look at and see if we can get a sense where you think you might fit among these options. Okay, should America lead and promote? Should America act when only enduring national interests are at stake? Or should America focus, serve its own people and put more conditions on cooperation with others? Excellent. So let's give it another minute. And I hope Chris will be able to revisit this poll later. Very interesting. We got lead, promote free and fair markets to promote democracy is in the lead at the moment. All right, let's see how it goes. Here's the roadmap to the conversation today. My goal here is to just provide a general sense about what this national security strategy is all about. What is an NSS and what's in this one. We'll have a break then, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation. Then we'll come back and talk about how this 2017 national security strategy fits in the context of history. How is it different from other security strategies? We'll have a break, another little conversation, and then we'll turn to the security environment itself. And we're going to have a conversation here about how this national security strategy addresses challenges in the security environment, not just today, but also let's think a little bit about what we're anticipating for the future for the United States, for its military, for its Air Force in particular. So please think about what you'd like to see the national security strategy address. And you can even, again, write it down or type it here. So when we talk about strategy, generally we have this kind of pat way of talking about ways, means to achieve some kind of a political goal. And we'll in our courses talk about the instruments of national power, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic instruments that help us to achieve those goals. So if this is something that we're talking about publicizing, what is the purpose of revealing it, right? Does it make sense to publicize the national security strategy? Well, first we might answer that question by saying, yeah, it's not going to reveal perhaps the minute details that would be in a classified, say, national military strategy, but it's going to give some signals to our friends, signals of assurance to our friends, and maybe some signals to competitors to see just, where we stand on certain issues so that we can establish some kind of strategic stability. But the origins of the national security strategy actually rest in a request from Congress to the President. So yes, it is your good old bureaucratic government processes at play here. Congress, which funds the military, from time to time will shape it. The 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act addresses some shortcomings that Congress saw in the way in which the services fought together. The Goldwater-Nichols Act established the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, created incentives for jointness, like tours among the various sister services. Congress was seeking to see a bit more cohesion in American strategy. And this extends to the executive branch. When we think about it, at this point in history, 1986, the United States had quite a large bureaucratic structure, many, many different agencies involved in national defense. So what are the administration's plans for the military? Congress wants to know. How does the administration see national interests? What kind of obligations does America hold to others? How do we see the instruments of national power utilized both in the near and long term? And also, what kind of balance among these instruments do we think we should be putting together? And then any other issues, right? So Congress is asking for all of this. And one broader advantage to having a public document like this, that's the product of all these different agencies involved in national security, is, perhaps best summed up by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was himself quoting an unnamed soldier by saying that peacetime plans are of no particular value, but peacetime planning is indispensable. So in and of itself, it's a good exercise for us to engage in. Congress did ask that the executive provide a strategy annually, and as we can see, the very first one was issued by Ronald Reagan in 1987. It's actually at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide and going chronologically. This is from the National Security Archive, which will give you links to all of these national security strategies. Very few presidents actually achieved that goal, right? You can see the Clinton administration had quite a good run there for a little bit. But it is good to note here that it's really quite an accomplishment of the National Security Advisor, General H.R. McMaster, and his staff, reportedly Nadia Shadlow and Seth Carter, that within 1 year of the new administration, they produced a strategy. So when Congress asks all these questions about America's national interest, I'd like to pause here a little bit and switch gears and see how the president himself saw that upon his inauguration.
We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. I will fight for you with every breath in my body, and I will never, ever let you down. America will start winning again, winning like never before. We will bring back our jobs. We will bring back our borders. We will bring back our wealth. And we will bring back our dreams.
All right then, what keywords did you hear in this 2-minute clip of President Trump's inaugural address? Looking to the president himself is one way to think about the answer to the questions that Congress is asking. But we can also look inside this document to see it as a product of not only the president and his particular vision, but also the product of a broader government process that includes those many different agencies. So certainly this is an America First national security strategy. The 4 pillars are topped by the Protect the Homeland pillar, which I think might seem obvious, but we have to remember that the homeland as a security issue has, been on the agenda, but really didn't get quite so prominent until after September 11 of 2001. Well, the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, gave us advance notice about the kind of interest that we were going to see in the assessment of the broader security environment. But here we see the president talking about homeland security, the economy, American prosperity, and growing American influence in the world. So then when we turn to the rest of the world, we see a return to great power competition. And I see that in some of your comments here in the chat of words that resonated from the president's address. So there's a lot of that. It's kind of a nostalgic view, right? So the return to great power competition, we'll see later, is a look at the 4+1. It is going to make America great, but it's going to make America great again, right? So we have that nostalgia. And it's also, I think here, nostalgic for the American way of war. After decades of small wars from the era of George W. Bush and continued, although a retrenchment over Barack Obama, now the military is looking out to these great power competitors, Russia and China, which are often referred to in the same breath, basically, the rogue states or revisionist powers of Iran and North Korea, and really thinking about bigger wars. This strategy talks about modernization, increased military spending. It talks about investing in nuclear weapons, even lower yield nuclear weapons come out of the Nuclear Posture Review, and talks about investing in space. So those two, the nuclear weapons, the space, and then of course an emphasis on cyberspace, were all of great relevance to the US Air Force. But there are some questions, of course, about whether the emphasis on sovereignty is something else, right? It's emphasized as a code for a lot more. So even though the document calls itself one of principled realism, that's actually only mentioned twice. and it defines it as outcomes, not ideology. I don't think that definition is as satisfying as one that sees strong sovereign states that may or may not cooperate abroad, which is where you get concerns about whether this may be a protectionist or an isolationist foreign policy. And I think it's really interesting that we see competition everywhere in this strategy. There's a question about how much we should read into it. Let's acknowledge that. You know, some have pointed out that this president himself has taken some controversial positions. And in this document, some of the language looks very familiar. Of course, every national security strategy is going to talk about, you know, the good of America, American values of freedom, democracy, the rule of law, right? But there also is some reassurance to allies in this document that may or may not have been there when the president first came into office. But if we look at the view of international relations realists Emma Ashford and Joshua Schiffenson, they lament that this national security strategy is not enough of a departure with previous strategies because it still in the end amounts to a strategy in which the United States is seeking primacy. This idea that the US will outcompete any peer, that the United States will prevail. So it's true that there's a lot of apparent cut and paste in this document. There's also some sharp language that I think we should pay attention to because, you know, with this domestic political agenda, talk about borders, talk about competition, I think all of these things are still on the table with this strategy. So let's pause here and have a little bit of a reflection on the worldviews that we saw and what you were thinking yourself in that first poll. I'll turn off my mic and entertain questions and comments.
Okay, so does anyone have a question about what Dr. Guttieri just talked about? And I guess while some people are typing, it looks like I actually have one. And I guess it's a question of language. So does this national security strategy reflect what might be considered a turn towards a Westphalian perspective of international affairs? And by that I mean in favor of the traditional nation state, you know, where each has exclusive sovereignty over its own territory.
Right. I think that we have, again, a certain nostalgia for that idea. We have to recognize that part of the worldview of this president reflects a kind of a populist sentiment within the American public about what has happened as a consequence of globalization. So for some decades, we saw this process of sovereignty in question as the nation state itself was kind of torn apart from within as states dissolved or failed, and then challenged or maybe superseded by other institutions like the European Union, for example. So when we talk about sovereignty in international relations literature, we're talking about a supreme power within a given territory. And we're also, I think, talking about whether it's internal and external sovereignty. So putting those pieces together, you have this idea since the treaties of Westphalia, you know, which were Munster and Osnabrück back in 1648, you have this idea of a sovereign being supreme within this realm, the state being supreme, because at that time there had been many other kinds of authorities that were contending. And so I think that's an interesting thing to think about in this era of challenge to authority. But second, you have this idea of it being over a particular territory. So even if you draw boundaries around people who are quite different groups socially, you still have the territory together. But the internal-external, I think, is the dynamic we're seeing playing out in this document, where it's I think, nostalgic for this idea that there can be a boundary to what America's engagement in the world is, both economically and politically.
Well, it looks like everyone's having discussions with themselves, which is absolutely excellent.
Awesome.
I did see, where is it? I did see Terry had asked a question. Well,
And I see Major Shemp has raised a hand.
oh.
Excellent.
Oh, it looks like Seth's wanting to see the result of the poll that we did earlier.
Yeah.
Do you want to show that, or do you still want to
poll?
save that one for later and actually?
The first poll, can we take a look at that again?
Yeah, I can pull it back.
All right, very interesting. Okay, it's not too late to vote, I gather, because I see some numbers going up. I wonder if it would surprise you if I were to tell you where I gathered these general, worldviews expressed in the national security strategy. They, in fact, coincide with those that we saw put forward by George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and my best summary as I could of what I was seeing in the 2017 Trump strategy. So we saw much greater emphasis in the George W. Bush about leading in democracy, and we'll take a look at that in part 2, of course. I'm curious why you all chose these particular worldviews, because there's, anytime you have multiple schools of thought, there's arguably value in each one of them. And so anybody who wants to express that, I'm interested too. I see an argument that principled realism is a departure from U.S. I can't read it all because this poll's in the way. Let's see. It's a departure from the internationalist policy that relied on international organizations and economic interdependence. Very nicely said.
Lieutenant Colonel Marlau has a question. Do you believe that the national security strategy forwards a narrative that gives up ground where the Belt and the Road Initiative continues to gain areas where we had greater U.S. influence?
I love that. I love that first part. Do you believe? That was in there, right? For my good old disclaimer. So asking my evaluation of what's happening with China's view is, there is this one belt, right, that China's envisioning that's going to be uniting the globe, and it is a global position, right? So that school of thought is going to argue that globalization is not a choice, it's a fact. And therefore, the United States needs some kind of security strategy that's going to acknowledge some of the interdependencies that our country has with others in the economic system, but also in addressing some of the challenges that no country alone can solve, not even ourselves. So the question was about the Belt and the Road, and I wish I could see it. How is the rest of that, Chris? Can you read it back to me?
Do you believe that the national security strategy forwards a narrative that gives up ground where the Belt and the Road Initiative continues to gain areas where we had greater U.S. influence?
Right. So we had this big debate over that question of whether the United States is giving ground in the Asia Pacific by withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and engaging in, bilateral rather than multilateral fora. And certainly that is the argument by experts who know China better than I do, that we're creating a vacuum in the region that's an opportunity for China. So I think, it gives, maybe not ground in the sense of actual territory as much as ground in the space of influence globally.
Okay, just for the sake of time, we probably should move on to part 2.
All right, let's do it. All right, and guess what? We have another poll for you to take in part 2. I'd like you to think about these various positions and tell me who do you think said what here. And I guess we'll give you a couple minutes to do that while I say a little bit about the context of part 2. The goal is really in this section to talk about what is new. So I'll pause my webcam and give us a little bit greater bandwidth here. And bear with me on this. All right. All right, I'm seeing answers coming in. This is great. I love this participation. Okay, but I can't see the whole question, but I know what they are. All right, so the first one is guessing Bush. And okay, guessing Clinton. So this question on immigration policy. That's talking about effective border security. This is a big theme in the 2017 National Security Strategy. And who is talking about border security? Is it new to be talking about border security? And so I've given you some historical examples here and asked who do you think said it. And so far, it looks like Bill Clinton in 1999 has a little bit of a lead, and we'll find out the results later. Interesting. Okay. A word cloud pulls forward what's frequent in a body of text. And I've put together here a couple of word clouds for you to reflect on. Gee, what do you see as new? What's pulling out for you here? And why do you think these clouds look so different? The Reagan strategy was the first one. Here, 30 years later, we have a comparison with the 2017 Donald Trump strategy. So certainly we can see how prominent the Soviet Union was in the 1987 security strategy versus current national security strategy, in which we don't see Russia even kind of represented in the word cloud. But I think also what's interesting about the clouds is what's the same, right? That we see, words like economic, like partners, etc., reflected in both of these. Well, it's also interesting that Reagan and Trump are both Republican presidents, but they had somewhat different worldviews when we dig a little deeper into their administration's security strategies. For Ronald Reagan, American liberty is tied to that of others, right? It can't be secure in a world where everyone else is threatened, right? But in the Trump administration's national security strategy, it is untethered. Furthermore, American values, which we see here in the second quote under the Trump national security strategy, American values are fine for Americans, but the United States is not responsible for the rest of the world. So I think in this we're seeing relationships as much more instrumental. Ronald Reagan is talking about how difficult alliances can be, but they have an overall greater value. And the Trump administration is talking about alliances as being, free, based on free will and shared interest, much more instrumental or transactionalist. If we turn to a comparison of how each used the instrument of national power, I think we see some interesting evolution as well. I would say of the 1987 strategy, what strikes me is how number one was that the moral and political example of the United States was specifically enumerated as being the top instrument of national power, the I there on the left-hand column. And although if you go to the right-hand column and you see under the informational moniker many of the same words, it's really more of an inspiration what the United States is doing. Instead, if you drop down in the Trump National Security Strategy column to the E for economic instrument of national power, this is where Donald Trump is really putting an emphasis on this sector. So if I had to make a personal call, which I think I would give this sector as that coming out of this strategy, economic to the point that it's a militarized almost economic worldview, right? Talking about things like energy dominance. Also in contrast, Ronald Reagan, under the diplomatic instrument, emphasizes the importance of alliances, as we noted, but for Donald Trump, even multilateral fora are there for the United States to compete and to lead. What's relevant to the United States Air Force, of course, is the military specifically, and here both are leading from a position of strength, making big investments in military instruments. Somewhat of a difference here is that Ronald Reagan is seeking to support friendly regimes, whereas Donald Trump's language is about direct action. So more about security assistance as opposed to direct action. And when we think about the emphasis on sovereignty that we discussed in the last section, that's a little bit of a tension. So now let's compare the strategy to the one that more immediately preceded it. So on the right again, we have the word cloud for the 2017 National Security Strategy. And on the left, we have the 2015 Barack Obama strategy that this one replaces, just a couple of years ago. So what words come out? If you want to type those out, you know, what do you see as different? What do you see as the same? As was noted in some of the comments, Barack Obama had a strategy that talked a lot about the global, right? That talked about institutions, that talked about American leadership, that talked about things like health. The Trump administration strategy, we can see that America is first, all right, but also we see emphasis on nuclear capabilities. We see replacement of the language around violent extremists with language about jihadists. If we're going to look at the 10 most frequently used words in various national security strategies, and here I've just grabbed kind of a sampling from past administrations. From the top, you see at the top under each presidential administration, you see the most frequently used word and the number of times it was used, going down in descending order in that column. We can see that at the top of most all of them is the United States or America. I've coded that in blue to make it easier to see. Obviously, that's in the title of the document, right? But if you look at what's in green, for example, you see that another common theme in these security strategies across different party lines is economic. That word comes up prominently in the top 10 in all of these security strategies. Under Reagan and Bush, we saw the words Soviet or Russian, and I put them together to try to sort this out, but they drop off, right? And well, if we look at what's in purple, we're talking about kind of the externally facing United States, the world and its issues, and here we see some pretty significant variance. I was curious about some other terms that were used or not used in some of these security strategies. So here, rather than by order of frequency, I've just listed these terms by order, alphabetical order, and these are terms that I was personally interested in. For example, arms control. It really struck me that in the early national security strategies, as I was going through them, lots and lots of discussion about what's happening in arms control negotiations, right? We're at this stage with this treaty, and if you think about it, it makes sense that the administration is communicating with Congress, is going to have to approve that treaty, right? So I think that that is really pretty significant, interesting difference that we see it dropped off today. Dropping down to the treaty as well, you see that word is on the decline. So I think overall this reinforces this idea about a shift in the strategy about American leadership in the world. Maybe nothing so much about the United States as the team captain, but maybe, with America winning, we will have so much winning, it's more like a WWE Royal Rumble. So we have this American leadership in the world as that, because we're not seeing the institutions again prominent. The United Nations is only mentioned once in this security strategy. Peacekeeping is not mentioned a single instance. Also curious about the strategy, again, is this homeland emphasis. And this is one of the first things that really jumped out at me when I read through the document. That if you look at immigration, kind of in the middle, under I, it's a big anomaly, right, and in this security strategy with 14 mentions. It might shock some to see that Obama in 2010 comes in second in mentioning immigration with 6 mentions. But going further down the list under taxes, there was this interesting discussion about the Republican administration's tax plan and tax cuts. Of course, this likely reflects what was going on in the discussions between the executive and Congress, but in the national security strategy, I thought it was curious and to have so many mentions of both tax policy and immigration policy, such profoundly domestic policies. So, what do you think is causing some of these changes over time? All right, what's behind these changes? To unpack one, which is the emphasis on the Soviet Union and Russia, I grabbed here a sampling of comments about the Soviet Union beginning in Ronald Reagan's 1987 security strategy, where the word Soviet or Russian is mentioned 252 or something like that times, talking about military superiority as now endangered. The Soviets had achieved parity, right, at that time, and so that was the big concern for the United States, was assured that our European allies, for example, were going to have continued access to oil resources in the Middle East. In 1990, what a change, with George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush, quoting the great diplomat George Kennan, saying, "The breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power, this we now see." So the Soviet Union, as I mentioned about those forces, was coming apart at that time, which was itself a bit turbulent for the international system, obviously. So in 1994, Clinton is commenting that Russia's future is uncertain, and then brings China into the conversation about maintaining a repressive regime. In 2002, George W. Bush comes in talking about Russia as being in the midst of a hopeful transition, but then in 2006, his security strategy then talks about wanting to work closely with Russia on points of common interest and also to manage differing interests. 2010, Obama says, Russia's reemerging on the world stage here. 2015, it's about Russia aggression in the Ukraine. So 2017, the Trump administration strategy mentions Russia a number of times. As I mentioned before, talking about China and Russia almost in the same breath, challenging American power and influence. So this is a good point, I think, to pause for a second break, and maybe we could look again at that second poll and see the answers that everybody gave there, and see what questions you have or comments. All right, so the poll said, who do you think said it? Border security and immigration enforcement must keep the country safe. It's interesting that there's that you all chose Democratic presidents as your most popular guesses, because I think generally speaking in the American domestic discourse we see border security associated with Republican presidents. And the leader here is William Jefferson Clinton in 1999, but the quote is actually from Barack Obama in his first national security strategy in 2010. So I think what we should keep in mind as, we have these kind of generalizations about particular presidents and their political affiliations and their parties, and therefore how the security strategy is going to be affected. We actually have a surprising number of continuities from one administration to another. And the questions, you got some questions for me, Chris?
Yes. Seth just asked, if we are worried about China and Russia challenging American power and influence, then why would the strategy be to withdraw from the world stage on many points?
I don't know if I wanted to turn my microphone on in that one. It's an interesting question. I'm interested in the answers that some of those who are in on the call might offer. I think that it might have
Lieutenant
more to
Colonel
do.
McDonald
Oh yeah.
just chimed in and said that, well, America first and withdraw from the world stage are not necessarily the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this has been repeated many times, right? The America First is not America alone, because you do have, many voices in the security strategy, right? Elliot Cohen argued that it's like, reading a Talmudic text because there's multiple voices here, and one of those voices is kind of maintaining on the America in the world. He's saying that there's one voice which he calls the Trump monarchist, that's saying things like America first, right? Talking about taxes. Then there's another voice which he's calling, I think in jest, the deep state voice, which is having that continuity with the past of keeping some of American alliance relationships first and foremost. And then the third voice that he notes, I think quite accurately, is there's what he called the bureaucratic redactor, because this document is a product of so many different, people coming forward trying to get their specific point into the document. I would say that even though there's that argument, America First is not necessarily America alone, that I think part of the argument too is to strengthen internally, domestically, develop some coherence, some protection, and then America will be in a better position engaging in the world. That's an interesting approach. So I think it's more likely that if we are sustaining our relationships in the world as Ronald Reagan was describing them, we're more likely to sustain influence.
Okay, we probably have maybe time for about one more question, I think, and then we'll go on to the third part. Well, I guess Daniel has a question about that use of language and messaging in relation to what you were just talking about. But America First may not mean America alone. But as you stated at the beginning, one of the main purposes of this document is to signal to our allies. So his question is, what do you think that message is that's being sent to other countries?
Well, I think a lot of the controversy is that it's a mixed message, right? So we had at the Munich Security Conference, for example, we had very prominent senator going to the security conference and talking about the importance of the liberal order, right? The rules-based order, in the sense of order among nation states and talking about the West, right? And challenges to the idea of the West. And it's not just in the United States, but it's also in Europe with Brexit and Britain leaving the European Union. You have these ideas of some challenges to this idea of the West. So this is John McCain at Munich talking about those challenges, but also challenges within that are dangerous. And further talking about challenges like transnational terrorism that we talked about in the first part of our discussion, in which you have this idea of a caliphate, which is really not such a Westphalian concept, is it? That ISIS was trying to establish in the Middle East. So we have challenges to this idea of the West. And I think the signals here are mixed, and we're just going to have to see how they get sorted out. And as somebody's pointed out rightly in the comments, one way we can look to see how things really will evolve is to look at the budget requests and what actually gets funded. But we've seen some contests between the president and Congress over things like Russian sanctions that are really important, I think, for us to keep watching.
Major Shemp, hold on to that question. We have time. I'll return back to it at the end, but we've got about 15 minutes or so left, so we got to get through another point yet.
All right, so let's hit you with the final poll here, and I'll pause my webcam. Okay, so what do you see as the greatest priority for U.S. national security? Let's take a look at the security environment, and if you could pick just one, which is difficult, what do you see as the biggest priority? And maybe if you want to, in the comments section, talk about why. So let's look at how this national security strategy addresses the security environment next. Chris, do I need to give them time to finish the poll, or can I move through the slides?
I could. Let me see if I can move it up out of the way enough that you can go through the slides. How's that?
It works for me. I hope it works for our crew online. Here I wanted to continue that theme of looking at the evolution from 1987 through to 2017. Between the Reagan administration and the Obama administration, we saw the decline of the Soviet Union and the rise of violent extremism, but we also saw some other elements introduced into the security discourse, elements like human security, right? Challenges of the environment, of population growth. Ronald Reagan's talking about them in maybe a little bit different language, but they're coming out, about resource scarcity. He had these concerns that were issued as early as 1987. In President Obama's security strategy, they're much more fully articulated, these human security concerns, and adding cybersecurity, which obviously wasn't on the agenda in 1987. But in contrast, in 2017, we see that climate change has completely dropped off of the agenda, right? The environmental issues have dropped off of the national security strategy. And this point has been much criticized in the commentary on the new strategy. We did have General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, kind of give us a telecasting that there's going to be this return to great power competition by looking at 4+1, meaning the two great powers, Russia and China, plus North Korea would be 3, Iran would be 4, and then 1 would be the jihadist terrorists. This 4+1 idea was already out there in the discourse. So the security strategy is just pulling that forward. And as General Mattis, the SecDef, had told us, this was going to be a return to great power competition. But it also is, domestic, looking at issues that are also in the Obama and Reagan strategies, but looking at them in the domestic context, right? So it has a strong domestic focus. It's not about the planet's health, it's about the homelands. I sum it up. So let's look then to the future and see what kind of trends that we need to be cognizant of as we look at the security strategy, also preparing us for that. And this is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence talking about global trends that are going to shape what's to come. And like in 1987 and 2015 security strategies, the DNI is concerned about demographics, right? For example, aging is a demographic. And here on the right of this slide, you can see a graphic depicting the degree to which the overall population of the world has been in poverty, which is in both of the colors together, but in the darker blue on the screen is extreme poverty, defined as under $2 per day. And over time, you can see that starting about, I don't know, the 1980s or so, that extreme poverty proportion of the overall population starts to decline dramatically, right? Because there was a miracle in Asia, right? There's all kinds of development in Asia, and as we can see also, there's all kinds of population growth. But the Western middle class then is squeezed, right? So we're feeling this in our domestic politics in the United States with the response to globalization. It's causing migration as workers in the global economy are seeking employment and the factors of production have gone global, and people are moving to mega cities. So there's one vision of the world in which cities are the dominant political entity. The DNI is concerned about reactions to these trends, worried about nationalism, about religion as divisive forces, saying that democracy itself cannot be taken for granted, as a warning to us. The implications for the military in part stem from the changes in relation to the forms of warfare. And the DNI argues that we're looking at a form of warfare centered on society, centered on critical infrastructure. And some of the trends that are observed here in emerging forms of warfare we have seen already. Standoff systems, right? But now we're adding robotics, we're adding information attacks as the United States and others have experienced. When we turn to deterrence, I think this is interesting. You have this change from a retaliation-focused deterrence to a fear of escalation-focused deterrence in the DNI's view. And looking at the dialogue with North Korea, looking at the nuclear posture review, which also recently came out, we see smaller yield systems, for example, that are blurring the line a bit between conventional nuclear forces. And the nature of brinksmanship that we heard in the conversation between the leadership of the United States and North Korea, may mean that this is already here, this deterrence by fear of escalation, and I'm really curious what you all think of that. So I'd like to stop here and reflect a little bit on your assessments of the priority and see how these, are relating to the priorities that we discussed in these other strategies and what the research is showing. So if we can see the results of the poll, that'd be awesome. I see lots of cybersecurity. I see votes for energy disruption. Okay, cybersecurity, transnational organized crime, and international terrorism both get some votes. Global economic well-being got 12%, that's 12% of the votes. That's interesting. And I can't see infectious diseases, WMD, other got no votes. Right, so we're seeing cybersecurity getting the most attention here, and so we can talk about that. After that, we see China and its expansion and the global economy. So all really interesting observations that you're making here. Let's get some questions.
Okay, we have about 7 minutes left.
Great. I see Ken talking about cybersecurity as something that impacts infrastructure and causing a lot of damage in a short amount of time. And I think that's an important theme that we're talking about with, the kind of hybrid conflict that's blending conventional and irregular forces. It's going to be, asymmetric as we've seen in other instances, but the concern about cyber attacks and vulnerabilities to it is very real.
Well, here's one from Lieutenant Colonel Stewart. He's asking, what is your opinion of the greatest priority for U.S. national security? Your opinion.
My opinion. Well, I believe that while we're in an incredible changing international system at this moment in history, there are some very common interests that do transcend national boundaries. At the same time that there's a competition in armaments and competition in space and cyber, what have you, with other great powers, at the same time that there's economic competition for kinds of work in the world economy, there's also kind of this existential security threat that's looming with changes in the climate, with the resource scarcity, resource depletion causing migration, with the integrity of the environmental system, of our air, of our water. So the DNI, I believe, is right to emphasize the danger of extreme weather events, for example, and we've all seen these happen quite recently. So for me, I would say this is an opportunity with those with whom we compete to find the common interest and to create a dialogue, because it seems not to make that much sense for us to focus on competition in that arena while something else is kind of coming at us.
Major Craycraft's asking, in regards to the secondary focus on North Korea within the document, do you think the U.S. and international community will accept a nuclear-capable North Korea versus starting a large-scale and costly war with them?
That's a big question, and I don't know that we have a choice, right? I mean, we've seen so many new nuclear powers that have just become a matter of acceptance, right? We saw, for example, Pakistan and India, both acquire nuclear capabilities, and it, you have to look at what the alternatives are to accepting the state of North Korea's technology. There's some discussion about, possibilities of some kind of dramatic action up front. I don't know, somebody would have to know a lot more than I do about exactly what we're capable of for that to make sense. I think with a situation in Iraq, we saw a preemptive conflict, right? We saw the idea was to go in and stop Saddam Hussein from acquiring nuclear capabilities, and then the United States and allies, ended up in Iraq for many years, and it was very difficult and expensive, and in blood and in treasure loss. So. All right.
Well,
I love your
about
conversation.
2 minutes or so left. So, Dr. Guttieri, if you want to wrap us up with a quick summary.
Sure. Did Major Shemp get his question in, though? I'm dying to know what that was.
No, he didn't. Let me see if I can find it real fast. Here we are. Can you speak to the increased involvement of information sharing language in the private sector? How do we engage with the private sector and still adequately maintain surety of our data security?
That is such an amazingly good question, and I can see why cybersecurity was looming large in this crowd, and I think rightly so. I was in Silicon Valley last week. Homeland Security Secretary was there. This was the top, topic of among those industry representatives there in this conversation. How do they strike the balance in sharing? They don't see themselves as media companies, so they don't necessarily want to be policing what goes on online. That's the information side of it. Then there's the data security side, right? The hacking, the theft of identity, the theft of funds, what it does to companies in the stock market. And that's a special challenge. I've been learning a lot about it from Professor Chad Dacus here in the cyber college at the Air University. He's teaching a course on cyber economics that I've gotten to sit in. And he's talking about things like how the companies who are developing tech want to be first to market and do things quickly, not necessarily paying attention to protecting the data and the integrity of the data. So this is a big problem. I wish I had the answer, but I agree with you that it's way up there. And thank you for asking that question. Okay, so I'll sum up then, now that I've pushed the time maybe a little bit. Thank you for bearing with me, everyone. This has been a lot of fun. I just want to conclude that here what I was doing was outlining what is a national security strategy about and how it sits in context of others. I hope that was helpful to you to get kind of some perspective about both continuity and change, and also to think about just the mechanics of how the document comes into being and what it's got to address. It was really interesting to talk also about where you see the security environment going. I think that this is something that we get to continue to have a conversation on as an educational institution. And I thank you all so much for being part of this discussion today.
Okay, and with that, we're going to conclude this webinar. However, even though the webinar is over, we encourage you to take this opportunity to remain in this meeting room, which I'll keep open, so that you can continue this excellent discussion you're having with your peers. In fact, I have to say we've done these webinars about half a dozen times now, and this group has been by far the most engaged. So on behalf of the eSchool, I'd like to thank Dr. Guttieri for leading this great discussion, and you, especially our students, for participating. Now, a recording of this session will be linked on program homepages, and before you exit, please use the chat module to provide us with feedback on the synchronous experience, to include what you found beneficial and any suggestions you might have on topics you'd like to see discussed in the future. Thank you.